So it is a true pleasure right now to be welcoming Christina Mittermeir and Paul Nicklen. Both are acclaimed, award-winning photographers, conservationists. Paul is a marine biologist who grew up in the Arctic Circle. Christina is originally from Mexico. She tells me, though, that she now holds passports. She has Mexican, American, and Canadian passports. Collectively, they have more than 9 million followers on Instagram, people who come to their accounts to learn more about the world around us, the Earth, beautiful photos from the far reaches of this planet. Honestly, as you're listening to this podcast, you might want to pull up their accounts. They are at Mitty, at Mitty, and at Paul Nicklen, Paul Nicklen, as you're listening, to see their incredible work. They're the co-founders of an organization called SeaLegacy, telling the visual story of our biodiversity, of our ocean, the goal to help educate, increase awareness, and we'll talk about how we can all have an impact. Christina, Paul, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Moshe. It's great to be here.
Mr. Wanunu, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Christina has told me before this podcast she wants to go by Mitty. She goes by Mitty, so we're calling her Mitty and Paul on this podcast. I want to begin today. We'll talk about our optimism about what can be done. But the state of play, I'm a news person, and I see the headlines, and it seems like there's a daily digest of concerning headlines about the state of our planet, the loss of coral reef, the warming Arctic, dire predictions about what's going on. Mitty, I want to begin with you. How would you characterize the state of things as we speak here in the spring of 2023?
Well, I don't want to be the doomsayer, but it is dire, Mush. It's scientists are telling us that by 2027, which is in just 3-4 years, we're going to be reaching the proverbial 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, which, scientists are telling us is going to be catastrophic for humanity. It's going to bring many more droughts, hurricanes, many more floods. It just becomes a very difficult to manage situation. So I think we still have a small window of opportunity to do everything we can to try to stay away from that 1.5 degree increase.
So explain why, to many people, 1.5 degrees seems pretty insignificant, right? 1.5 Celsius, 2.7 Fahrenheit. If I go out and it's 80 degrees or it's 82 degrees, that doesn't seem to make much difference in my life. But explain why that is so important when it comes to our planet.
I think it's wonderful that not wonderful, but it's both terrifying and a good opportunity when you see moments in time when you get these little spikes to see what happens, spikes in temperature. And 6 years ago, we were on assignment for National Geographic. They pulled me off the middle of a shoot and said, you must go focus on the blob. And that was that body of water in the Pacific Ocean, an area of water that went from Mexico up all the way to the coast of the United States, off of British Columbia, and up into Alaska. And it was water that warmed several degrees Fahrenheit. And what would happen when water warms several degrees Fahrenheit in the Pacific Ocean? Well, we saw millions, tens of millions of seabirds die. We saw hundreds of whales die. I was up in Alaska photographing hundreds of sea otters that were dying from paralytic shellfish poisoning from that warming temperature. There was an algae bloom, and you're watching these sea otters by the hundreds take their last breath. And and that's just it. People don't. We're a species with a very short memory. When there is a hurricane, a disaster, when we were sitting there and photographing and filming post-Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas to look at places where over 1,000 people died from the biggest hurricanes recorded in history, parking itself, getting bigger and moving slower. These are just slight shifts in temperature, but what comes with it is just absolutely catastrophic and devastating. My biggest fear is that we're going to go from a species that ignores and it's out of sight, out of mind. And when we finally wake up to what 1.5 really looks like, it's going to be too late. We're going to have that shift. There's not going to be that middle ground where we say, oh, that was our moment to act. That was our moment of opportunity. That's where we could have made a difference. But you know what? I keep talking about my favorite movie right now is Don't Look Up with Leonardo DiCaprio, because that analogy of that asteroid coming to Earth. And we see this all the time where we'll be on stage talking about 1.5. What does it look like? This is what 2027 is going to look like. And, the host will say, wow, I hope that asteroid hits my ex-wife's house. Ha, ha, ha. It's kind of like this disconnect that we have. And you're right. We are always constantly trying to make that connection to how serious this is.
But I think, Mo, if I may, the most important thing about this is that some of the changes that are already happening are irreversible. That means we cannot turn the clock back to make things, to undo the damage. Coral reefs, we've already lost over 60-70% of the coral reefs. And it's not something that you just replant and get the whole ecosystem back. As hard as some organizations are trying to hold off the damage, it takes thousands, millions of years to build an ecosystem like a kelp forest or like a coral reef. And we need these ecosystems. Imagine that you're flying on an airplane and you're seeing nuts and bolts flying out the window. You would be really worried. We should be very worried.
Translate for me the impact, these things like coral reefs and biodiversity in the oceans, and what that means for someone who lives in Chicago or Nebraska.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the role of the ocean in our global ecosystem. The only reason that life exists on Earth, and we know of no other planet that holds life, is because this planet has a living ocean, and it is the right temperature, and the ocean absorbs already 25% of carbon emissions and has been doing it for a long time. Photosynthesis in the phytoplankton helps maintain the carbon balance on planet Earth. In addition, that same phytoplankton, along with other habitats like seagrass and mangroves, produce 50% of the oxygen we breathe. Imagine if we lost 50% of the oxygen. How would you like to hold your breath half the time? And on top of that, the ocean holds 80% of the biodiversity on the planet, and 3.5 billion people depend on ocean protein for their survival. It's a pretty important ecosystem.
Also regulates global climate. I mean, when you think about the polar regions, for example, and that's really what I've been specializing for, mostly for National Geographic for the last 20 years on climate change issues. But when you see people say, oh, it's just we're losing ice. What does that mean if we just lose ice? Well, when you look at sea ice, for example, sea ice is basically like an inverted garden. So you have in the spring, the sun returns to the polar regions, you get photosynthesis, you get algae and phytoplankton growing underneath that ice. Then you get zooplankton, the amphipods, the copepods. And then in Antarctica, you get the krill. And the krill is almost equal to the biomass of humans on Earth. I mean, there's just such a great biomass, but all of these ecosystems need to have ice as the foundation of their substrate to start their life cycle. And from there, you get the cod, the polar cod. In Antarctica, you get the ice fish, and then you get the ring seals, the bearded seals, the harp seals, all the polar cod, all the fish, all of this life, the narwhals, the belugas, and at the top of the food chain, you have polar bears. And when they say, scientists are saying we're going to lose polar bears in the next 100 years due to loss of sea ice, that means we're losing this entire ecosystem. The whole ecosystem is going to collapse. Sure, maybe a couple of species might thrive, but it's and then all of a sudden, then you've got the Gulf Stream. You've got not just the Gulf Stream, but you've got the current.
The parts that are invisible, that are terrifying. These input of fresh water into deep sea currents, because we're basically changing the chemistry and the physics of how our planet works. And we don't understand the consequences fully, but it's not going to be pretty for humans or for wildlife because we are pretty fragile. We can only survive in a very small range of temperature and wonderful climate conditions, and we're losing them.
Right. While this planet has fluctuated over billions of years, humans have only been around for the very last part of it, while we've had this sort of equilibrium. The most comfortable part in Earth's history, after several billion years of getting it together, has been our part, and that's changing. And Mitty, what you're talking about there is the sea ice melting. That's adding fresh water into the salt water, and that's changing the dynamic of the ocean there. But it's fascinating because these are the far reaches of the planet. These are areas of the planet that most people will never get to, but are able to see because of people like you who head up there. Paul, you grew up there in the Arctic Circle, and I had the good fortune of seeing a presentation you did a bit ago in New York talking about growing up in the Arctic Circle. Talk to me about even in your lifetime, the evolution that you've seen up there from childhood to when you return there now to continue your photography.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when you grew up with the Inuit, back then as a kid, we had no telephone, no radio, no television. So I spent all my time outside with the Inuit. And that is to see the true masters of their environment, just like how Christina's worked in the Amazon with the indigenous tribe there, and to see how connected they are, how they can, it's mind boggling to see how connected they are to that world. And then their world is consistent. The ice forms every year in a certain way. It forms around a certain time. The ice cracks break up every year. Well, now they say they don't even know where they're living anymore. The ice is disappearing weeks to months earlier. It's thinner. It's rotten. They're not able to access their hunting grounds. Christina and I were working in Connaught, Greenland. And historically, you think about how the Inuit from Greenland and the Inuit from Baffin Island would share genetics between their huskies to build the super dog that was the biggest engine and workhorse of the Arctic. They for the last 25 years have not been able to access each other because of open water that is now does not freeze between, so you're seeing changes absolutely everywhere.
There was a time where during winter, there'd be a major freeze and you'd have ice for a good portion of the year. And that doesn't exist
anymore.
Bridge. An ice bridge.
Yeah, and then you think of the ice bridge, for example. Now that ice is open all year round. I mean, there's no ice. I mean, sure, that water's open all year round. There's no ice there at all. And then, you have scientists talking about, Greenland melting. We see all the ice caps melting. When we're in Antarctica working down there filming penguins, we've been working with a guy by the name of Dion Ponce, who was actually conceived and born in Antarctica. He's been there every year for his 45 years of his life. And he said when we were there, saying he had never seen pouring rain in Antarctica before, where all the penguins were covered in mud and their downy feathers and they're dying. He said, this is unprecedented. So I see it through the eyes of the people, the Inuit. I see it through the eyes of the scientists. We see it with our own eyes, but this change is happening dramatically. And for, again, people in New York, they say if Antarctica melts and Greenland melts, and this is the first time in recorded history that the entire ice cap of Greenland is melting, that sea levels will rise 200 feet. So what is that going to mean for coastal communities around the entire world? It's going to change the world completely as we know it. New York, where are you? I mean, you're probably going to be underwater.
I'm in Brooklyn, and I'm probably within a quarter mile of the East River here.
Yeah, well, I would be 178 feet underwater here. So it's it's obviously these are all signs that we're heading in the wrong direction. And you talk about millions of years of cyclical nature of climate change. When you go to NASA and look at the data yourself, I was in Dome C on the Antarctica ice cap, photographing the Italians and the Russians and the Americans digging ice cores miles deep into the ice cap of Antarctica, looking at the ice core samples, looking at the climate data, how much CO2 was in the atmosphere over their data that they can go back has gone back now 800,000 years. And 100%, it is a very cyclical cycle. It goes up and down the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it never got above a certain point. And then you look right there at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it just blows off the chart like a big hockey stick. Go look at it yourself. Just type in climate data on the NASA website, and it will blow your mind, and it'll scare you see the trajectory that we're on.
The real problem is that a lot of people think that this is going to be like an event, oh, well, we're screwed and we're going to die. It's going to be 100 years that are going to be pretty miserable for humanity unless we act and do something. Because with all of these disasters and catastrophes, the economy becomes destabilized, populations become destabilized. You're starting to see millions of people become refugees, and of course, we don't want
right. This whole idea
of
so this whole idea of climate refugees, that due to the changes on our planet, that for years we've known refugees because of drought or war or various individual events. Now we're creating climate refugees from certain places.
Yeah, and you see it so clearly. I was just in the Omo Valley of Ethiopia visiting with some of the most remote and resilient tribes that have lived in these desert conditions for generations and generations, but nobody can live without water forever, and at some point those people have to move and they end up living in the cities, and all of these destabilizes politics, economics. It disrupts the way that we live. And you know what, Moshe? The planet will shake us off. Humans may disappear, wildlife may disappear, planet Earth will continue. It will continue to evolve. Maybe in 1 million years, we'll see a different group of species, animals that had never lived before. Nature is amazing. But while this is happening, it's going to be horrific and not comfortable. And not fun. So why don't we do something about it? I'm a solutions-oriented person.
Yeah, you guys both are photographers, and I'm curious as to how your passion for photography and seeing the world, how it translated. When was the turning point for each of you when it came to, wait, I'm not just a photographer. There's a larger thing I need to focus on here. There's a larger conservation of the planet that I need to get involved with.
It's very interesting, Moshe, because I was, you come up through the ranks of National Geographic and it's like being in the NFL, but there's only one team, and like it doesn't get any better than shooting for National Geographic. They're sending you around the world shooting incredibly important assignments. And it's when I met Christina in 2008, and I'd have heard her name before that because Christina comes from a very strict, serious conservation background. And she said, she came out in 2004 and said, our planet's in trouble. You guys are on the front lines. You guys are more than just journalists for National Geographic. You guys are storytellers. You are conservationists. You are part of the story. And I actually resisted her in the beginning. I'm like, how dare you tell me that I'm not just a journalist? I mean, there's no higher badge of honor in our profession than being a journalist that's showing the good with the bad, unbiased journalism, right, pure and honest. And then I started to look around. I'm like, she's right. Like the industry has billions of dollars for marketing and promoting, like Shell Oil. Well, how much money can they put into promoting their product and putting all these clean energy ads? And, here we are underfunded, starving, running around in tie-dye t-shirts saying, take care of the earth. And it was at that moment, I'm like, she's right. And so in conjunction with doing assignments for Geographic, we started to go off and do conservation-driven storytelling under the guidance of Christina. And we were having conservation wins where actually I was like, this felt really good. Like having an article in National Geographic's great, but seeing the follow-up and the follow-through and actually being part of a community that's winning and speaking out and protecting, and whether it's marine protected areas or chasing big oil off the coast of British Columbia, whatever it is. So under Christina's leadership, it felt great to win, and there's no better feeling now. And that was when 2014 we started to have. I went kicking and screaming into social media, but very quickly got my first million followers, and then 2, and then 3 and 4 million. I'm like, wait a minute. We actually, rather than publishing in National Geographic once a year, once every 2 years, which is great, but we can now publish every day on stories that we believe on our own social media channels. So that's why collectively we have over 10 million now, and we wish it was 500 million. We need a bigger microphone to get people to wake up about this planet.
Social media gets a bum rap, deservedly so. For the impact that it's had. At the same time, the three of us would not be speaking today if it wasn't for social media. What is, you guys shot for National Geographic, the biggest magazines in the world, etc. What have you learned in the social media age about your ability to tell stories and have impact?
Well, I think in 2012, when we were just coming up with this idea of maybe National Geographic is not a big enough microphone for us, and Instagram was just starting to happen. I think there were a few years there that we believed that we could tell these stories and really reach a global audience and have a conversation directly with our followers. And then, of course, Meta, Zuckerberg decided that no, they'll decide who gets to see your content, and
they keep the algorithm locked up.
Yeah. The illusion has died a little bit. So. As communicators, we need to go back to other media, to podcasts, to earned media, to in presentations, live presentations, what we call ocean diplomacy, just getting up on a stage the old-fashioned way and reaching 1,000 people at a time, because social media is no longer what we thought it was going to be. And that's a shame. There was a moment there.
When it comes to, Paul spoke a bit about what's going on in the Arctic, especially. Mitty, any recent assignments you've been on where you're witnessing the impact of the changing climate on wildlife and of course on human beings as well?
The thing that strikes me the most, Moshe, is just how little we know about how planet Earth works. You hear Elon talk about going to Mars all the time. And if you were to be invited on his spaceship to move out of planet Earth, you would get a pretty serious briefing when you boarded his spaceship. And yet, here we are on little spaceship planet Earth. This is our spaceship carrying us across the universe all alone. And, we survive on what we know. And it turns out we know very little. If you were to open the hood of our spaceship planet, it would be all salt water. It'd be the ocean, because that's the engine that keeps life on Earth. And we don't know how it works. So you go to a place like the Bahamas and you realize that these reefs that people used to talk about are no longer there. We dove all over the Bahamas. We spent a year diving there, and most of the reefs are in really bad shape. And you think, is it the warm water? Is it sediments from the shore? It turns out that species are missing. It's not just fishing, it's disease that's coming up in the ocean. And we know so little about the biodiversity and how it works that we don't even understand how the disappearance of one animal causes a cascading effect that has tremendous consequences for the entire habitat. And we carry on as if as if Earth was indestructible, but it isn't.
But just think about how beautiful it would be to move to Mars. I mean, to travel that distance and go there and live under a glass bubble. And if you go outside, you're instantly dead. It's all one color. The red would be beautiful for about 5 minutes, and then you'd be looking for another color.
I've seen the Matt Damon movie. I thought he did a pretty good job of.
He did a great job in that film, here we are, this incredibly lush, rich, beautiful planet that we live on that is 4 billion years of arriving at a point that it just wants to keep everything alive. It's a beautiful, evolved, fantastic ecosystem. It's the food we eat, the air we breathe, and somehow we know more about space than we do our own planet. And it's scary and shocking. But I have to be for some positive news. Moshe, this has been
I wanted to turn the conversation here, but thank you, Paul, for taking it positive.
Yeah. I just think that, even on stage with National Geographic 20 years ago, when I was seeing first signs of climate change and I was shooting assignments for them so even the scientists are like, we know something is up. We looked at even the data from the Russian submarines that the water's warmed that the ice is half as thick as it used to be in the 60s and 70s. All that stuff was coming out. And I was sort of like trying to talk about it on stage, and even National Geographic, which again has integrity, but they're like, quit upsetting our audience. Don't talk about climate change too much. We want to keep this light and entertaining. And I'm like, so at least nowadays, instead of being a freak for bringing up the word climate change, you'd be a freak for not mentioning it. The fact is that we're all talking about it. We're all aware of it, whether you're Republican, Democrat, we don't want to get too deep into politics here, but whoever you are, the world is aware. And then if people are, and I don't blame people for not wanting to believe in it or wanting to talk about it, because, it's stressful. It sucks to care, and it's stressful to care, and it's worrisome. And, but we have no choice.
What are the things that are keeping us from really shifting, And it is inertia. Like Paul is saying, it sucks to have to change everything that Oh my God, I have to buy a different car.
Well, I will say, Mitty, for many people, it's the bottom line. Like economically, they feel and
the system. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, that ultimately, wait, my gas prices have gone up $1. Why can't we drill more? Why can't we allow the drilling in X, Y? So to the counter here, to the people who say, like, listen, I love planet Earth. I think we'll figure it out. We figure everything out. But it seems like some of the things you want to do are going to make my bills in a time of inflation even more expensive.
Yeah, so it's a very selfish system of values that puts personal profit over common good and, survival of our species. And we're all going to pay the price for that. But I'm also seeing a tremendous change in consciousness, because I'm going to say the majority of people are really worried. The majority of people want to do something. And we would all love for this transition to happen without us having to pay more for our fuel or whatever, right? It's going to be expensive and it's going to be painful. And yet it has to be done, because we know that if we keep going on this same business as usual, it's not going to be pretty. So there's a number of things that we can be doing that are, I think future looking and visionary. And if you imagine all this carbon that we have in the atmosphere, imagine that it's sitting in a bathtub and we have to deal with it. Well, we have to do two things. We have to turn off the tap, and that means we have to cut emissions and focus on renewable energy. And then we have to empty the tub. And that's where nature solutions come in. Keeping the ocean alive is a great way of maintaining its ability to decarbonize the atmosphere. We're learning that whales are great allies in this process. We didn't know until recently.
How are whales our allies here?
Well, whales. Paul, you want to explain? Because these
No,
animals
you're
are.
great. You can do your poop loop. You can talk about what a whale is worth. You can.
And
This is.
and I should say, both of you have spent much of your lives, I don't know if you've calculated it, under the water, documenting what's going on there. But I yes, please, Mitty, go on whales as our allies here.
Well, whales, of course, we almost exterminated many species of whales during the whaling years, and they just started coming back. And now we're learning that when whales dive deep, a mile and a half into the bottom of the ocean to feed, they're eating krill. And krill is, of course, dependent on plankton. But whales are bringing all those minerals and very rich nutrients up to the surface of the ocean where they poop. And that poop becomes fertilizer for plankton. And plankton, of course, is like a miniature rainforest in the surface of the ocean that is, through photosynthesis, absorbing carbon and exhaling oxygen. We need whales to fertilize plankton. And it's invisible. We don't get to see it, And it's not a matter of faith. As scientists, we know that this is exactly how it happens. And the people that are working on keeping whales alive are telling us that we need about 100 times more whales than we have today. Because the plankton is disappearing as the water gets warmer, as it absorbs more carbon dioxide, it also becomes more acidic. Water that's acidic is not supportive of life. And so plankton can survive. I mean, it's just these things that are difficult to fathom, but they're happening. So yeah, we need to keep whales alive.
Keep whales alive, and it sounds like we need to figure out how to get whales to have even more whales.
Exactly.
Well, we had, we killed
around by not killing them.
We killed around 400,000 blue whales, the largest animal ever to exist on this planet. And now they've recovered to a point of 10,000. They're still down 99.5%. And you think that in Iceland right now, this summer, they continue the whaling of fin whales, which are the second largest whale in the world. There's one guy who found a loophole in the even the president's against
one
it. One guy is killing probably 50, 60 fin whales this summer.
122 this year. Yeah.
And nobody can really eat it. There's so much mercury in the meat. It's kind of toxic.
So this is just like a cultural tradition, basically?
Yeah, just somebody exercising his right to go out and kill, a sentient being that's 80 feet long.
He calls it a fishery, Well, whales are not fish. And anyway, it's those kinds of loopholes that you just scratch your head and you think about the value of a single whale. There's a scientist, he's an economist with the International Monetary Fund that just came up with a number of $3 million is the value of that asset to any economy. A whale that's helping us decarbonize. Because that we don't have to build a machine to absorb carbon. It's already out there in the ocean. All we have to do is keep it alive. But today, no country in its P&L has whales as an asset. And that is a problem because if they were, you would think very carefully about allowing somebody to kill 122 whales when every whale is worth $3 million.
The challenge here feels overwhelming. And it is. It's our entire planet, right? And so in many cases, people who would be wanting to help will throw their hands up in the air because it's too much and it's too scary. And let me go on TikTok and look at something happier that makes me happier. What do you tell people about what they can do, either through organizations, through donations, through volunteering, etc., for a task that seems as overwhelming as saving our planet?
Well, the good news is that there are solutions and that scientists know how to fix the problem. And they actually have told us. Maybe 2-3 years ago, Paul and I came upon a scientific paper by a scientist called Dr. Carlos Duarte. And he and 20 other scientists came up with a plan, a roadmap for rebuilding marine life in a single generation. So by the time I'm a little old lady, if we do these 6 things that they recommend, we could see a thriving living planet. So the 6 things are we need to create more marine protected areas. And now the world has a mandate to protect at least 30% of their land and water by 2030. So a lot of countries are racing to find the places that should be protected in their territorial areas. The second is we have to protect species. And things like whaling and keeping dolphins in captivity need to become a thing of the past. We also need to exercise federal legislation to protect sharks and sea turtles and all of these animals. The third one is that we have to figure out the pollution problem. We have to stop pollution from entering the ocean. And it's not just plastic. Carbon dioxide is a pollutant. And, everything from fossil fuels to sediments to fertilizer, all of that stuff, we need to figure it out. The fourth one is we need to rethink how we catch protein from the ocean. We cannot continue carrying out industrial fishing as we were before we knew how important biomass is to the ocean ecosystem. The fifth one is we have to restore the ecosystems that have been damaged, coral reefs. We need to put real investment into restoring mangroves and seagrass beds. And the final is we have to stop ignoring the ocean. It's barely mentioned in the United Nations General Assembly. The ocean is 1/4 of the solution, so we have to cast it as a solution to climate change. And so that's what SeaLegacy does. That's our framework of reference for the kinds of stories we tell. And the biggest problem that the ocean has, that the environment has, is a lack of funding. So, Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about?
No, tell. I'm just going to help Moshe do this interview, just because I know you so well. No, Moshe, you're doing a great job, honey. No, but tell them about you're super philanthropist. I mean, I think that we need a movement. Is the only thing the power of the people are greater than the people in power, and we need to create a movement, and we need people to become. You said 1 billion people giving $1 or more a month. Imagine billions of dollars going into ocean conservation to create the world's first major super philanthropist. When you think in the United States that $500 billion are given every year to charity, well, 33% of that goes to religion, 15% goes to education, 11% to arts and entertainment, and go down the list. And at the very bottom, honey, you tell them about the 1.8.
1.8% goes to the environment. So the pyramid is inverted, right? And
wait, so less than 2% of all philanthropy in the U.S. goes towards the environment.
That's correct.
Environmental causes. That includes climate change, oceans, biodiversity, extinction, all of that. So I'm not saying don't give
and horses,
to
dogs, and cats.
Yeah, I'm saying let's flip the pyramid and let's rethink our charitable giving for the next 10 years to really be biased towards environmental restoration, because our global survival depends on it. And Americans, we are the most philanthropic people on the planet. And at the same time, we are encouraging a lot of corporations and businesses to think about investments in real conservation and real environmental restoration, not just lip service and greenwashing. And I think it can be done, Moshe. I don't think it's all lost. It's massive, but there's a lot of innovation happening. And everywhere we go, we meet thousands of people that are doing their part, innovating, advocating, lobbying, and donating.
Beyond donation, are there other practical things that people? I mean, we have a lot of parents who listen to this podcast who are raising children, and we're pretty diverse here. We got people around the world listening. Majority are probably Americans. What else in terms of practical things beyond writing a check are things that they can be doing that you see having an impact?
I think that, every time you pull out a visa, every time you order in a restaurant, every time, every action you take, if you factor in our planet in that cycle, we think about, is this good for my health? Is this good for my kids? Is this good for my wallet? Is this good for my bank account? Is this good for my love life? Ask yourself, is this good for the planet? And then I have friends who are like, hey, Paul, I'm really on the fence about having a fourth kid. Like we have 3, we don't really know if we need a 4th, but we're, Susie needs a playmate. I'm like, if you factor in the planet, you're not going to have the 4th kid when you look at the amount. And the other thing is just be brave enough to start becoming educated. Quit turning a blind eye to all the issues on this planet, become educated. Then you factor that into your day-to-day life, your routine, where you're going to go on holidays, how you're going to get there, what you're going to eat, what you're going to buy, what you're going to order in a restaurant. And then all of a sudden your kids will grow up and they'll be at school and they'll say, wait a minute, my parents really are against single-use plastic. My school is full of plastic. Maybe I'm going to go talk to the principal about having a plastic-free school. Whatever it is, once you start going down that path, you take that one small first action, or it could be joining the tide with SeaLegacy, following the work we're doing. And that's a really low entry point into seeing all the actions that we're taking, all the storytelling that we're doing. And what I love about the work we do at SeaLegacy is that there are 5,000 ocean conservations alone in the United States, and it's mostly small mom and pop people with no funding, they can't even pull a salary, they can't barely survive. So we amplify the work of other people who are out there doing great work. So, just take that first action to get involved, whether that's giving $1, whether that's Googling the planet instead of being on TikTok for 6 hours a day.
What about 100 for the ocean? So we recognizing that there's this massive gap in funding. Think about this for a second, Moshe. The United Nations are telling us that in order to keep our oceans alive, we need an investment annually of $174 billion. And that's not just donations for conservation. That's infrastructure. That is building blue economies. At the moment, there's only $25 billion in investments for the ocean. So we have $150 billion that need to come from somewhere. As photographers, we are making a contribution by donating. We invited 100 of our friends to donate a print each, and we're trying to raise money for ocean conservation. So if you go to www.100fortheocean.com, you can buy a beautiful print. Think about Teacher Appreciation Day. Think about your Christmas gifts coming up. Go and buy a bunch of prints. All that money is going to go to ocean conservation, and you're going to get a beautiful thing in return.
I'm talking to 2 award-winning photographers here, and I wanted to talk a bit about what you guys do, your profession a bit, because I find it so fascinating. If we go to your Instagram accounts, we see very up-close encounters with bears, wolves, whales, amazing pictures. Paul, I saw recently you were quoted as saying, "The animals dictate the encounter." Explain how you approach being in these habitats, approaching these creatures, and keeping your calm to capture these amazing images.
Yeah, absolutely, Moshe. It's when you spend as much time in nature as we do, when I've seen 3,000 polar bears in the wild, 2,000 grizzly bears, this is my happy place. This is where I'm at peace. This is where I do my best work. And, when you're around animals this much, you know very quickly that the best work that you're going to do, the most beautiful, powerful, evocative storytelling imagery that you're going to make is when an animal is completely relaxed around you. And so, the great Robert Capa, the war photographer, said, if your pictures aren't good enough, then you're not close enough. And that can be tricky with a grizzly bear or a polar bear. And, but if you are relaxed around these animals, and I'm truly naturally relaxed around these animals, then all of a sudden, if you can have a grizzly bear 6 feet away from you, acting very naturally and you can be photographing that animal on a wide angle lens. I mean, in all 35 years of filming and being around bears, I've never had a scary encounter. The only time people say, tell me something really scary that's happened to you. It was going into the New York Metro subway station for the first time by myself, absolutely petrified. I had my wallet in my front pocket. I went down the stairs like I was going into battle. Some guy saw the fear in my eyes and actually attacked me at 5 o'clock at the end of a day. And I was with these 3 women from National Geographic who actually defended me, punched their card and pushed me through the gate, yelled at this guy. And it was just like, but I think the guy saw the fear in my eyes and it just triggered an aggressive response. And, I don't have that fear in my eyes when I'm around wildlife and nature. I have a feeling of calm. And so when you can let an animal behave its natural self around you, and if it wants to get close to you, then it's a beautiful thing. And you just sit there as a fly on the wall and you document the magic, and then you share that with the world. And then to go back to your other question about social media, if we just the way we've talked, we've been pretty negative on this podcast, more than normal, but I appreciate the opportunity just to speak about the state of our planet. It's an honest truth that we have to talk about. And I think, but on social media, if we just put up negative every day, people are going to get horrified and sad and depressed and not follow along.
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas Christina talks about, Martin Luther King, that he doesn't start off with like, I have a nightmare and we're all doomed. It's like, I have a dream, but this is what we have to go through to, so you get that narrative arc. And it's the same with social media, that you have to put up the beautiful, the interesting, the gorgeous, the educational, the entertaining. And then once you have this base trusting you and following you and coming along on a journey with you, then you can punch them in the head with something really horrific and awful.
Remind them that it's not all well.
It's not all well with the world, but then they're ready for it. They're like, okay, so I like you, I trust you, and now you have me as one of your disciples or one of your followers or one of your,
and then you offer
supporters.
The solutions. Then you say, together we could be funding the people that are protecting whales, and they have the technology, they have the science, they know how to protect these whales. They just need our funding and our support. Or we can be supporting the people that are replanting corals around the world. They already know how to do it. All they need is money to keep doing it. And SeaLegacy, that's what we do.
Paul, a couple notes as a New Yorker here. Never make eye contact on the subway. And I should say, by the way, I've lived for 14 years now, never been attacked. So I just want to make a pitch to New York. It's not as bad as, I'm sorry that was your first experience in the New York City subway.
I've had 1,000 beautiful ones since.
Okay,
so yes, it was just my first, and it was just horrific. But I was trembling. I was so scared. Some guy yelled, "Hey, you!" and I stared up, and I stared him right in the eye, and he just probably was, and he looked at me, and he walked towards me, and I started to tremble, and my takeaway from all of that is your scariest encounters have been with human beings and not with animals, despite being up close with animals that typically would create some fear. Mitty, talk to me about how you approach getting up close with some of the largest creatures on Earth.
I just love animals. I'm just so mesmerized by what they do and what they look like. And I have this curiosity about their daily lives. Where do they go? What do they know? When you see a sea turtle, we photographed some loggerhead sea turtles in the Azores and off the coast of Portugal. The water is so cold. And you're like, what the hell are they doing here? And then you look at the tags, at the scientific tags on their fins, and you realize they were born in Florida. And somehow they swam 4,000 miles to the coast of the North Atlantic. And one day they will make a U-turn and they will return to the same beach where they were born. How do they know that? To me, that's all fascinating. How do sperm whales dive to the pitch black of the ocean depth and find giant squid? And then you see them and they come up and they have these tentacles dangling out of their mouth. If you came face to face with a giant squid that size, you would be holy moly. And these whales are routinely diving to places that humans have never been to, as divers, because we can't. And I'm just fascinated by that. So when I'm in the water, I try not to be scared, and I try not to behave like a prey, because then, predators sense. I mean, it's just like a big dog, right? If you run away, the dog will chase you. So you try to keep your cool, and you try to keep your curiosity and calm energy. And, most of the time you're pleasantly surprised.
Animals are always sensitive. They're very, very intelligent. They're very social. They're very, even sharks, how many shark deaths are there on humans a year? And there's,
5
billions of people in the hour, billions of hours that people are in the ocean every year. And,
I spent a lot of years in network news, Paul, and we make sure to cover the hell out of all 5 of them.
Absolutely. And you pump them over and over and over. That fear sells, right? But the only emotion greater than fear is hope.
You two are some of the few people left who will sit in the same place for hours observing what's going on. Or more than hours, months, to be able to capture that perfect picture. And we live in an era where, something takes more than a few seconds. You're looking down at your phone, you're moving on, people get distracted, etc. I'm curious about just attention spans. I imagine you are mentors to the next generation of photographers who are growing up in this era. Talk to me about the importance of just taking a moment and taking it in. Paul, I saw you were quoted as saying that when you take people to Antarctica, the first thing you tell them is to put their cameras down and just observe. Right. The importance of observing things around you, patience, etc. Where things stand in 2023 in an era where no one can. I mean,
there's 2 worlds. I mean, I always say I have ADD, and I've never been clinically diagnosed, but we have text, Signal, WhatsApp, DM. We have Bing, Bing, Bing. Our phones are going all day long, and then I look down at my computer. I have 12,000 unopened emails. I've got 14 emails that are half written going into my drafts. It's a crazy world, but you put me in nature, and all of a sudden, it's a form of nature bathing where you just stop and you start to breathe these longer, slower breaths. You start to look around. You start to see the eagles and the frogs and the fish and you just start to see this whole connected ecosystem in front of you, and you start to relax, to sit by a river full of salmon with ravens and eagles, and you're waiting for a spirit bear to come out of the rainforest, this rare white bear that lives here in these forests. To sit there for a month and not see anything, you're the happiest, most blissful you've ever been waiting for this bear. And when it finally emerges, it's something so beautiful that you could never have imagined it. And it's just a very calming, beautiful place to be. And we have become quite disconnected from nature. I mean, I was in Hawaii and there was a family all on their devices sitting on a beach, and right in front of them was a humpback whale that was breaching. And it was just out of sight of a hearing sound. So maybe half a mile offshore. I bet you they were Googling where to go see whales, like put down your phone and look up and look around you and take it all in. I mean, my favorite thing, like I'm going this weekend to turn my phone off for a full week. And I don't care if I miss business. I don't care if I miss important phone calls. I don't care. I need to disconnect and reconnect with nature. And that's really the one place that I feel grounded. And that's where I go find hope and inspiration to keep moving on this path that we're on.
There's something really interesting when you get in the water, whether you're scuba diving or free diving, is that your breathing really changes. Last week, we had a guest here in our house, one of our board members. She's deep into transcendental meditation, and she was telling us about it. And it's no different, focusing on your breath and spending 10 minutes just, clearing your mind. It's what we do in the water. But what ends up happening is it gives you the ability to be present, to calm your mind and be present in conversations, to really listen to what people are telling you, and to come up with answers that are not selfish and that are not self-serving. And, that's a real superpower that humans have, to be present with other humans. And we're losing that because of our devices. Paul and I marvel, we go to these events and you meet somebody and they spend 30 minutes telling you all about themselves. They don't ask you a single question about you. We are losing the art of conversation. How are you doing? Tell me about you. It's such a simple thing that builds bridges of empathy and understanding between humans.
I mean, imagine a family, the kids come home from school, the parents come home from work, they've been busy all day. Imagine if they all just put down their devices instead of saying, look at this, I saw this on the video today. Look at TikTok. Look what Jimmy said. Look at. Imagine if they put their phones all away. They did 10 minutes of breathing, just very sort of calming, meditative breathing, clearing their minds, and then all started to ask questions to one another about, what did you learn at school today? How was your day at work? Imagine the feeling. I feel like a sense of calm where we've just gone down this dangerous rabbit hole of becoming disconnected from the world, and we're getting more and more disconnected. So to get people to care about their planet, our planet, and our place in this world, we really have to start opening up our hearts and our souls and our minds to personal growth, as well as, and I just read a really powerful book called The Untethered Soul. When I just sailed across the South Pacific for a month. I didn't have a drink. I worked out every day. We didn't have our devices on, and then to start reading books again. I see all these books behind you, the power of reading. That's where Sapiens on the wall. I see that's a great one. To see, to start reading again, and just, it's amazing when you fall into that, but you don't realize how far we've gone away from that. But it's there waiting for us. You can make a decision immediately to change your life. And as soon as you become curious and you start asking the right questions and you start thinking about how we're all related on this planet, great things.
Yeah, I was doing an interview earlier this week with a guy named Carlos Whitaker, who wrote a great book called How to Human, about connecting with people again and engaging people in basic conversation, and finding out that there are human beings behind the comments on social media, and that we actually have much more common.
Human, I like that.
Yeah, it's add it to your reading list. We'll be putting it out as an episode soon. At the same time, making the pitch for technology here, we've never lived in an era where everyone has a camera in their pocket. And as photographers, I'd love your perspective on that. The fact that several billion people on Earth have the ability to take effectively unlimited photos on a daily basis.
You know what it's done, Moshe? It's really given us visual literacy. And for me, because I started my career as a conservationist first and as a scientist writing about conservation first, and realized that people don't really like to read science. They don't even like to hear about it because processing numbers and data is not our common language. But photographs, you really lower the price of entry because we all have that visual literacy. And today, every one of us carries a device in our pockets that makes us experts. So photography becomes a great way of inviting people into the conversation. We love wondering, how did the photographer make that image? And you start asking questions. Were you scared? Were you hungry? Were you cold? Whatever it was, it's the first step in human dialogue. In how
and you think about the power of a photograph, creating real change. You think about, how controversial the Vietnam War was, for example, and it's all the politics and the protests, but it's, really, when it comes down to it, it's a young girl running down the street burning from napalm, right? That you see this image and it grabs you by the heart and punches you in the head. And you're just like, it's the power of that. Our starving polar bear had over 2 billion views around the world when we put out that video. That is 1/4 of the planet saw that video. And these are the images that really that take on a life of their own, that live on forever, that speak to the world, that are crucial in creating a movement. And so that's what we're always trying to do, is make that connection to a global audience using the power of visual storytelling. And there's so much work ahead of us because we have a lot of work to do.
Do you think there's a limited impact in terms of photo? Is there a way to get more people to be able to see this in person? And the concept for years has been zoos, right? Or SeaWorld. It's like, oh, we'll bring the animals to the people, and that should help with this process. And I'd love your perspective as people who see animals in the wild, that challenge, that debate of, we want people to be able to see the beauty of these creatures, but we can't take 9 billion people to the Arctic with us.
It's a very powerful question, and it's one that we struggle with a lot because, when we were filming orcas in Norway in 2011, 12, 13, a big story for National Geographic, and ultimately through the efforts of a group of us and under the guidance of SeaLegacy, we were able to ban big oil from drilling in the Lofoten region of Norway by using the power of storytelling, mostly using the charismatic species of orcas. That there's 2,000 orcas that are feeding on herring every year. So we had this great conservation win. But when we were doing the filmmaking and the storytelling, it was just us and BBC, National Geographic and BBC out there, a couple of other little tourist boats looking at the whales, but nobody was getting in the water. And all of a sudden now there's 150 boats. And because of all this publicity that BBC and Nat Geo put out there, now there's, 1,000 people there. Now the whales are being harassed. Now the whales can hardly feed. So it's like, if there had been policy in place before we did this big campaign. So it's like, the orcas are fine. They're feeding. It's better than having an oil spill or drilling or seismic exploration. But still, there's just a lot of people on this planet.
I recommend the documentary that Paul and I just watched called The Last Tourist, because it's a real education on how our tourism inclinations can also be very destructive. And I really think, at the end, it has a very positive ending because you can learn to be a better tourist. As for zoos and aquariums, it's very difficult to make blanket statements. I grew up going to the zoo in Mexico City, and if I had not been able to see animals, I don't know that I would have pursued this career with so much passion. And when you say, oh, we cannot allow any animals to be in captivity, what you're saying really is we cannot rehabilitate animals that are, distressed in the wild and need a place to go. This happened here at the Vancouver Aquarium, where the public demanded no more marine mammals in captivity. And as a result, they couldn't rescue sea lions and porpoises that were in distress anymore. So, there's a place for captivity when it's compassionate and when it has a rehabilitation purpose. We should not be kidnapping animals from the wild for public entertainment. That's a different thing. And definitely, animals like orcas do not belong in captivity. It's cruel and inhumane.
So we'll end here. We were a little dark in the beginning, and then we started to bring out the light. And this has been an incredible conversation, and there's so much more to talk to both of you about. But I'll end here with what gives you hope as you've been engaged in these careers as photographers, as conservationists, and you make these trips around the world, especially as you see some of the impact of what's happening on the wildlife. What continues to give you reason for hope that we can turn the corner here?
For me is the fact that we're having this conversation, that the fact that perhaps more than ever, because, you have an incredibly intelligent, educated audience. You yourself are a very aware, awoke, human being and ask great questions. I feel that we can have this sort of gloves off, open conversation. We can rattle around in a little bit of negativity. We can talk about truths. We can talk about fears. We can also talk about hope. And I think that gives me hope that we have an ability with someone like you in today's day and age, using your social media channel, your channels, to speak to a great audience about something like this. And I think that's a huge, like, 20 years ago, we wouldn't even have had considered having a conversation like this. You would have lost your entire base and all your following, and nobody would have respected you and would have called you fake news or whatever.
Oh, some still do, Paul. Don't worry. Yeah. Why are you fear mongering on the podcast?
Right. So let's fear monger. Let's just talk about it. And that gives me hope that we're having this, that this next generation coming up is really, and we're seeing a lot of people, great leaders, brilliant minds taking on important issues. And yeah, what about you, Mitty?
I want to close by talking a little bit about the incredibly hopeful power of storytelling, because until recently, it was very difficult to raise money to tell stories. They were deemed just as entertainment. But more and more, we're realizing that storytelling is the best tool that we have to convene people around the table to create a common vision and to bring people to a common point of view. And we just did that in the Bahamas. We had been there telling the story of shark protection in the Bahamas, and then Dorian hit. And we went back to the Bahamas to tell the story of what happens to countries that have no input into the carbon emission game, but they're shouldering the burden of these hurricanes year after year after year. And then COVID hit. And Paul and I had just bought our boat, the SeaLegacy 1, and we headed to the Bahamas just because there was nobody there. But we could see the economic impact of no tourism, right? I mean, 90% of their income is tourism, and all of a sudden there's no money coming in. So they decided, the Bahamas, that they were going to start doing oil exploration. And while we were there, the Stena Ice Max, this oil exploration ship from the UK, came and they started digging in the bottom of the ocean. And I remember sitting in our boat thinking, how do we stop this? What can we do about this? And then one day, we see this little boat coming from across the Gulf Stream, and it's an American scientist, Dr. Austin Gallagher with Beneath the Waves, is one of our partner organizations. And he comes on board and he says, Christina, I've been putting cameras on the fins of these tiger sharks. And when I look at the footage, I can see that they're swimming thousands of kilometers over seagrass meadows. So we started asking questions. How big is the seagrass meadow? How much carbon does it sequester? And Austin and his team discovered the largest seagrass meadow on the planet. It's 92,000 square kilometers. And the carbon that is sequestering is equivalent to 10% of global emissions. It's a massive discovery, one that can change a lot of things. Using the power of storytelling, Paul and I were able to bring people around the table from the government of the Bahamas, from the business community in the Bahamas, to build a blue carbon marketplace that is going to generate more money than all the oil that they could have extracted, and it's really giving them an opportunity for a blue economy. There are solutions like that happening everywhere. And storytelling is what allows us to share this news with the world so that we all can keep the hope.
Wonderful note to go out on. Mitty, thank you for your storytelling. Paul, thank you for your storytelling. Paul, good luck with the tech detox. We'll see you on the other side. But with that 12,000 email inbox,
yes, thanks, Moshe.
I don't have high hopes of getting my email answer in the future.
Thanks, Moshe. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.